Namaste, and welcome back to Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives 2022. This conference is being supported by the Earth Charitable Foundation. This afternoon, and this fireside conversation, we're going to be talking about China. Is it an inherently unsustainable state? With us today is Abhijit Iyer Mitra. Abhijitji, welcome.
Thank you, Raviji. It's always a pleasure to be back at a VM conference, as always.
It's great to have you back. So a little bit of background for our audience. Abhijitji is a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. He specializes in defense economics and has been a visiting fellow at Sandia National Laboratories and the Stimson Center. He regularly publishes on defense and foreign policy, and I highly recommend you to go out and read and check out some of his writings. For our audience at home, just a reminder that if you want to submit questions to Abhijitji, put them in the Q&A tab on the right-hand side. It says Q&A at the top. So Abhijitji, let's dive straight in. We had a great conversation 2 years ago. This one's a little different, a little more direct. We're talking about China. So let's start right at the fundamentals. What is China as a country, as a state, and what is its model of governance?
So, look, to understand what China is, we have to understand what China was. And what China was fundamentally, like India, a very heterogeneous, a pre-industrial, largely agrarian society with its fair share of baggage. Since then, what you've seen is genocidal wars, a complete eradication of society under the Communist Party, and a complete reforming of society under the Communist Party, and a sort of forced homogenization, which simply didn't exist. A homogenization of language, a homogenization of culture, a lot of what the Soviets tried to do, for example, in the other Soviet republics. The good thing about the USSR was that it broke up. The not so good thing about China is it's not going anywhere, and that's fine. The problem is the policy mistakes that China made are compounding, and they're not going anywhere. The problem, of course, is that we keep talking about the policy successes. I mean, look how this poor country that was poorer than India at independence is a middle income country today, an industrial middle income country. The problem is very few people, and this is the problem. It's like the F-35 program was too big to fail kind of thing. It's just too big to fail, and people don't want to look very carefully at the negatives or somehow think the negatives don't matter. And that's what China is today, a time bomb, according to me.
Time. Let's pick up on a few things because you give us a sort of beautiful overview and lay of the land. So, you mentioned the Chinese economic miracle, but let's start earlier than that. You mentioned this homogenization of Chinese culture. So let's dive into that a little bit. Can you give us a breakdown of what Chinese society was in terms of its cultures and its traditions and its tribes, let's say pre-CCP? And then let's add on to that, this idea of the CCP does claim to represent the Chinese culture. So how does that play into what you were saying about the homogenization and the kind of eradication of the classical civilization that we're referring to?
All right. So let's look at all the components of, well, a nation is an imagined state, right? We decide we're a nation, therefore we're a nation. But what are
so just clarify that for our audience, what you mean by a nation is an imagined state. Yeah, I think that's a great point. So let's dive in. Yeah.
well, you have religious countries like, say, Pakistan or Israel. You have linguistic countries like Germany or France, or you have countries that identify an ethnicity like Italy, for example, both language and ethnicity, so an ethno-linguistic state. You'd have ideological states like the USSR or the USA. For the USSR, it was socialism. For USA, it's the American life, the clean slate. You come there and you make your life. So with China, what is it to be Chinese today? And the problem is, there's a huge contradiction. So if you break down what it is to be, or rather, what the process of homogenization today is, the Chinese empires, the Qing, the Ming, the Yuan, all the Tang, the Han dynasty,
Yeah.
it was fealty, like all pre-modern states, to the emperor. You owe fealty to the Ming emperor or the Qing emperor, etc., etc. The concept of a nation state wasn't there. And China has largely struggled. You look at this even during Sun Yat sen or the warlords period and the latest warlord periods. There have been several warlord periods. So we're looking at Yuan Shikai and people like that, and the Kuomintang. It's been a very different idea where it is ethnicity is accepted, but the linguistic adherence is now enforced. The problem is there's also a certain cultural adherence that you are now shoving down everybody's throats. We saw this in the USSR. So, for example, in the USSR, it was fundamentally European. So, if you go to, say, Uzbekistan, on the one hand, and Mazari Sharif in, well, Uzbek dominant Afghanistan on the other, they're as different as chalk and cheese. I've been to both sides, and you actually find Uzbek people who take Uzbek Muslims, I mean, only in name, Muslims only in name, who take salted pork fat and vodka and go sit and look at fellow Uzbeks in burqas on the other side of the border. Because this was an area that got completely Europeanized.
Right.
With China, it seems to be linguistic, it's ideological, it's cultural. I think the only cultural variances that are allowed are maybe cuisine and the rediscovery of local cuisines. But even the architecture gets completely standardized in a way where it wasn't standard throughout China. I mean, you look at different kinds of architecture in different places. For example, Mongol architecture. Or, I mean, the Mongols did copy a lot of Chinese architecture, but you'd now
Yeah.
see a kind of homogeneity from north to south, which you sit down and think, am I in Disneyland? Like, my first visit to China was to this thing called Middle Kingdom in Hong Kong and near a place called Ocean World or something it was. And it was almost a caricature of, the Forbidden City.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I've seen
that's
photos. Yeah.
kind of what you're going towards today. So the heterogeneity that you see, the ethnic, the cultural heterogeneity, it's something to be curated into a museum today, whereas everybody else is expected to conform to what it is to be Chinese.
So very briefly, maybe in 2, 3 sentences, can you give us a specific example of what you mean by linguistic homogeneity is being enforced?
Sure. So Tibet, right? If you go to Tibet, for example, you see that their entire culture is pretty much wiped out. If you're going to be wearing typical Tibetan clothes, or even if you speak Tibetan. So, for example, if you're staying in Old Lhasa near near the Jokhang monastery, what's going to happen is you don't they don't the troops and people like that won't even respond to Tibetan. The signs are all in Chinese. You have very few
Okay.
Tibetan signs. You're under perpetual surveillance. There is a need for cultural conformity.
Okay. So the language, the medium of interaction is enforced, that, and it's almost culturally enforced. Okay.
But
Um,
also religion. If you're going into Jokhang very often, you're going to get a midnight knock on the door.
yeah. So this makes sense under sort of communist ideology. Let's pick up on that. Let's go back to this idea of, then, has the CCP then really betrayed to some extent the Chinese civilization?
Yes, the first and the worst victims of Nazism were the Germans themselves. And China is very much that. The biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party are the Chinese people themselves. If you want to look at what a self confident and free China could be, that would be Taiwan. Where you allowed expression, you have a huge amount of creativity. It's a fantastic, innovative population. And here it's constant control, 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 and you don't know how to get out of that. And therein lies your problem.
Yes. So it's this authoritarian control, and therefore this enforcement of the communist ideals of homogeneity, no religion, everybody, the state supersedes individual liberty and individual flourishing.
It's 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 more than just the state supersedes. It's, the interests of the Communist Party are conflated with the interests of China, and they're not necessarily the same. I mean, you look at it even at the worst times. The Japanese occupation in the 30s was
Yeah.
horrific. The war was horrific, right? We've all seen the rape of Nanjing and things like that. Uh, the thing is, the Japanese at their worst killed about 11 to 15 million Chinese. The Communist Party, through acts of commission and omission, has presided over the deaths of what? Lowest estimate 35 million, or if you go by Jung Chang's estimate, about 70 million. And that's just Mao Zedong's period. You know, that's not good. In India, for example, we used to have famines every 10, 15 years in which a few million people would die under the British. But independent India has never had a famine. The problem here is an independent China killed off more Chinese citizens than an invading occupying power. And that's problematic.
So it's very clear then that basically the CCP has betrayed not only the Chinese civilization and the Chinese culture, but also the Chinese people to a great extent. And let's stay very briefly on this topic of Taiwan. We don't want to spend too long here, but the sort of CCP line here is they have some legal rights to this. That some time ago a treaty was signed by the US, and legally it's theirs. Would you briefly care to comment on this stance?
Uh, it's legally not theirs. Legally, there is one China. Now, the
Okay.
question is, who is the legitimate government of China? A democratically elected Kuomintang government in Taipei, or a unelected government that rules over 1.45 billion, 1.3 billion people in Beijing. uh, and this really is the thing, and it sometimes leads to very curious situations. Taiwan, right up to the 80s, even after China signed the NPT, through the 90s, was pursuing the nuclear bomb, and they felt there was absolutely no legal contradiction because they were China. China wasn't China, they were China, and therefore they had a legally recognized right to have a nuclear bomb.
Yeah. So from my understanding, that the democratically elected government are effectively almost, it seems, in exile um, from their own state and own territory, which is, yeah, it's a sort of very odd way of looking at things. Let's stay on the Chinese government and their authoritarianism. I mean, you're saying that this is inherently unsustainable, but they clearly have a strong grip on power. Yesterday, Joachim Book in What Is Money, he mentioned that if you digitize currency, that then you can use it, if the government is in control of that, if it's centralized, then you can use it as a form of social credit and social control. Now, it seems like the Chinese state, the CCP, has a chokehold on the social credit system, on its people's movements, and it has a very firm grip. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So in two parts, can you just briefly outline how they're doing what they're doing and how effective is it? And it seems pretty strong. I mean, it doesn't look like it's going to break anytime soon.
Right. So, you had this sort of what I think is an axial age, which is digitization and then the information economy that comes about, where a whole host of fairly dictatorial states like Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Greece, Turkey, they all democratized through the 80s when the digital revolution started.
Yeah, yeah,
And what you find is that was because they valued their people. Because, industrialization requires a strong state, but digitization and the information age require the state to take a back seat. Now, in
yeah.
this particular case, you find that China refuses to take that back seat. You've achieved social control. People do not go around rioting on the streets, and therefore the state doesn't need to have a heavy hand. And then you allow those freedoms to pick up. So, digitization. So, when you talk about digital currency going cashless, it is a outcome of an industrial state which has certain legal protections, privacy protections, rights, etc. What China does is it copies the outcomes and applies it to its own systems of control. So, for example, surveillance, mass surveillance, phone surveillance, social media, and social media is actually the perfect exemplar of Mao Zedong's "Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom." You give everybody the opportunity to do the Chinese equivalent of tweeting, and then you see, aha, see, you're the one that's disloyal to the party, you're the troublemaker, you're the splittist element, as they call them, etc., etc., and they use it to arrest people. Right? You have 24/7 surveillance, and sometimes it's really shocking because I was crossing over to North Korea from China, and they had my entire travel record with them. What the lady didn't realize was there was this other lady was holding up a mirror or something like that where I could see my record. And even before I gave my passport, it recognized my face and had all my entries into China with my photos at each entry. So if there'd been facial changes or anything recorded and things like that. So it's things like looking at your phone records, looking at your payment records, synthesizing. It's not just the data collection; it's the fusion of data that's totally worrying. And this is why they concentrate on artificial intelligence, because for them it's social control and data fusion that artificial intelligence does in a way, which really interests them. So normally for us, digitization should be a process for enabling the citizen. Their
Yeah.
digitization is a process for controlling the citizen.
So it should be pointing towards sort of individual liberty and individual flourishing. And what you're saying is that the converse that's happening. It's the Chinese state is using technology to curb individual liberty, just to essentially stifle individual citizens from flourishing. Um,
Right.
let's let's pick up on this. We've got a question in the chat, and I'm also going to add something on. So the question in the chat is, what of the Chinese diaspora? What do they make of China? And I'm going to tag onto this idea. So I was talking to a friend of mine who spent a few years in China, and what she was saying is that this Chinese authoritarianism is spreading through their diaspora, through their an extension of their foreign, let's call it, agenda, into British universities and American universities, and discussion and discourse and debate about what China is doing in its model are being stifled externally in countries that they should not have any sort of authority in. So where does the Chinese diaspora sit, and how and what is China doing to control this narrative outside of China?
Sure. So let's look at the stages of the diaspora. There's the pre-communist diaspora, which is actually quite critical of China and doesn't like what they see. But then there is the latest wave, and
Can
ever
you
since.
can you add time zones to this
Sure.
diaspora? So when did
So
they come out? And,
everybody who left China, say till this, even up to the 60s,
yeah,
would be quite critical of China. And then, of course, there was a complete closing down of China. It was very difficult. Even by the end of the 50s, it was impossible to leave. And then you had this wave when China opens up through the 2000s and the 2010s, where
yeah,
China floods literally every Western university with students. Now, that is the dangerous part. That is where the authoritarianism spreads. It's not in the previous waves of external migration. So, India, for example, uh, in the 1800s, because of the Taiping Rebellion, we received a lot of Chinese. That's the Calcutta Chinese, who came at that point of time and moved to America, and during the gold rush and things like that, to work and
yeah,
so
a few other places, yeah.
on. They're very different. It's the ones that have the connection back to China. And this goes back to Deng Xiaoping and Tiananmen Square. People don't realize that. When Deng Xiaoping started his liberalization process, it was a genuine liberalization. It was genuine laissez-faire, where uh, individuals were building businesses. And Tiananmen Square was a manifestation of that individual liberty, because these were not people tied to government demand. They weren't tied to government purchases, etc. They weren't tied to a public demand, essentially, public sector demand. And at Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping realized that the more economic wealth he gave to his people, the creation of the middle class that is independent from you, that does not depend on you, and therefore will challenge you. And overnight, literally overnight, the economy changed to one where even today, the majority of demand, 70%, is public demand. So people don't realize that a lot of this construction, all these empty buildings that you see, this wasteful infrastructure like a collapsing train system, etc., etc., etc. Why is that? It's because the state has to keep everybody invested in the state. And so what you find is all these students who come abroad, either they are members of the CCP or their parents are members of the CCP, and they're all on the gravy train, somehow economically dependent on the CCP, and therefore they constantly need to peddle Chinese Communist Party talking points. And
So,
if they
so
don't,
70% of the demand you're
yeah,
saying in China is public sector. It's the Chinese government paying and demanding and producing these goods.
exactly
Wow.
right. Exactly
Okay.
right. I mean, you look at the train system or the construction industry. It's what construction industry is about $2 trillion. The entire
Yeah.
train network is close to $1 trillion. They're all
I mean,
horribly bankrupt.
yeah, we
That's
saw what's happening with Evergrande and the sort of failure and
yes.
this house of cards essentially collapsing.
And,
But this is a problem because if we stay with this, then economists and businessmen were surprised to some degree by what happened with Evergrande. And when we say it here, it seems so obvious that look, 70% of this demand, these cities that are being built in China that are ghost cities, entirely empty and then collapsing and falling down. So it seems blatantly obvious, but to get reliable data out of China about COVID or anything economic, it seems impossible. Um, is there an avenue here, for example, to start to get reliable data and maybe to open that up?
I don't see any. So for the last 10 years, for example, I don't know what the current iteration is, but it's variously been called One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know what the latest name is. It started
Yeah, they
off,
keep changing it. Yeah,
we keep changing
yeah,
it. For the last 10 years, we've asked for a feasibility study. I don't think anyone that I meet on the track 2 or even on the track 1 circuit has ever seen a Chinese feasibility study for uh, OBOR, BRI, XYZ, whatever it is right now.
true.
Uh,
Yeah,
the problem here is, it's apparently a joke, but then Gorbachev apparently confirmed it was true that when he was agriculture secretary, he apparently asked Yuri Andropov, who was at that time the head of the Soviet Union, I need the actual. Apparently, the finance minister asked that he needed the revenue figures in order to plan the state budget of the USSR. And the finance minister was told by Yuri Andropov, I'm sorry, those are state secrets, you don't get to see them.
yeah.
You see a lot of that happening. We don't know who's collating information or where it's going, etc., etc. It's gotten a lot worse under Xi Jinping. Actually, under people like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and things like that, we actually saw a considerable loosening up of data. But that's become a lot worse under Xi Jinping, where you actually see data concoction possibly happening. We have no way of confirming under Xi Jinping because there's a general climate of fear which was not around when Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and people like that were around.
So yeah, I mean, we're painting a pretty bleak picture here. So I'm going to take some more questions from the audience. But before we do that, um, the CCP is having um, leadership challenges in October, and sort of where are the rays of hope here for the Chinese people? When they're looking for an opening up, a liberalization, when they're looking after their own interests and flourishing, and where do we see this changing? Or if you think it's inherently unsustainable, where do we see it falling down?
Unfortunately for the Chinese, I don't think uh, there's a ray of hope till the economic crash happens, if it happens. Because, a command economy can always manage an economic crash or hide it and, window
Yeah,
dress
you can hide it. Yeah,
to
if
a
the numbers are
certain.
made up and don't mean anything. Yeah,
Exactly. So what ends up happening is, I don't think Xi Jinping is going to go anywhere because he's probably the most powerful Chinese leader we've had in the last 200-300 years. He's certainly more powerful than Mao Zedong. Now he's not the smartest man around, but I guess the entire audience has watched Legally Blonde, right? So
I
what
have it. I have it. So you'll have to enlighten me.
if you watch Legally Blonde, this is like your typical blonde stereotype that the blonde can't understand the law, the blonde can't understand legal affairs, the blonde can't understand economics. But there's one thing that the blonde can do, which that nobody else can do, which is get the rich man with the Rolls Royce and the private jet and everything. So Xi Jinping is a lot like that. He's probably not the most competent manager of the economy, but he's an extraordinarily competent manager of power politics within the CCP. And the way in which he neutralized the Guanchis and the cliques and everything like that within China was truly incredible. I did not think anybody would have been able to do that, because those cliques were developed very specifically to maintain a sort of power balance and checks and balances and a kind of oligopolistic rule, which, like coalition governments in India, that's when maximum growth and freedom and things like that happens.
Yeah.
Sadly, we have this man who's an absolute genius at manipulating his way right up to the top, who manages to neutralize literally everybody in the party hierarchy in a way that even Mao Zedong did not manage.
Okay.
And he's not very good at running the economy, or he certainly seems to have a very Soviet. He has all the worst of the Soviet Union in his economic thinking, in a sense, which is something that Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin actually worked very, very hard to avoid.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very interesting way of looking at it. And certainly I come from a finance economic background, and we can see that. We can see that in the influence and the sort of methodology and approach of the Chinese sovereign fund outside of China, and what it's investing in, what it's purchasing, and what it's promoting. I'm going to bring in some audience questions. So for our audience at home, keep them coming in. They look extremely interesting. We've got Peter Emerson, one of our speakers from yesterday from the De Border Institute for Democracy, in the chat as well. So we've got one from Brother G. Bedker. He says, does the message that the CCP is representative of an ancient Chinese civilization actually cut through and establish its legitimacy in Chinese society? So, it's a question of legitimacy here.
In Chinese society, yes. But we don't know how much of that is earned legitimacy and how much of that is legitimacy through fear. Because, there's nothing really Chinese about the Communist Party. They are not Confucian in their general outlook, except that they love hierarchy. They are really not run by the kind of scholar bureaucrats that you require. Rather, they're run by business interests and cliques. So, even looking back at the way the Chinese looked at governance and administration, their approaches to, say, dealing with minorities. Uh, well, in some of that, the CCP does a very good job living up to the Jungar genocide and things like that. But in other things, other than the fact that they look Chinese and speak Mandarin, it's very hard, and eat with chopsticks. It's very hard to find a Chinese person. I keep asking all my Chinese friends, what do you feel is Chinese about the CCP? And the standard answer is, well, they rule us and they're Chinese. Where's the cultural identifier? Like in India, for example, if you're left wing, you'd have a natural affiliation with the Congress, or if you're right wing, you'd have a natural affiliation with the BJP. What are you going to do if you're Chinese? I mean, what is the
Okay.
marker of being Chinese? And they stoke a lot of ultra nationalism, and it's more a territorial nationalism. And this is why territorialism is so important in the scheme of things, because for them, it's the territory that makes you Chinese.
We see this a lot in sort of other centralized governments where expansionism acts as a sort of effective distraction for the majority of the population. I like that. So essentially what you said is what legitimizes the CCP, and the only things that make the CCP Chinese, that they look Chinese, they speak in Mandarin, and they eat with chopsticks.
Pretty
Yeah.
much.
Okay, let's bring on the next question. So we've got one from Manoj Mishra. He's saying most Chinese students return to China after studying abroad. He's saying greater than 80%. I don't know these figures, so we'll check them. And that number is around 20% for Indian students. So how does China encourage its people to invest its talent back in the country? And is this driven ideologically or by government policy?
Oh, so this is something the Chinese are very good at. It's mostly government policy. It's two things. It's one is the Pakistan syndrome. In Pakistan, every Pakistani you see on the news who's something or someone usually lives in Dubai or London or New York. But Lahore and Karachi are their stomping grounds.
Yeah, the party grounds.
Right. So what happens in China is if you're very rich, you do have you spend a lot of your time abroad and China is your stomping ground. But because China, there's so many contracts and things to go about, for most people in the higher income groups, like higher middle income right up to high income, which is a huge population, there is an incentive, like I said, about Chinese students to come back to China to manage the family business and things like that. Especially with the one child policy. It's not like in India where, oh, my sister and her husband are looking after my parents, and my brother's looking after the family business, and I can do my own IT job. You have
Yeah,
only one child, and the entire filial and financial responsibility falls on that child to come back.
it's like a,
This Yeah.
it's like a family business essentially is what you're saying, and there's a
Exactly.
finance incentive.
And the entanglement with the state. The second thing
Yeah,
there is that, the Chinese are very good at hiring people, at identifying talent and offering them a sort of research board, funding, institutional recognition, a lack of ethics where research can be pushed beyond boundaries, legal boundaries that the West would be comfortable with, which are extremely alluring to people. So it's almost like, so in India, what happens is if you're an Indian policy person, you climb very slowly, step by step by step. If you go
yeah,
abroad and get the white seal of approval and come back to India, it's like snakes and ladders. You literally go from 1 to 99 almost sometimes.
right,
Uh,
right.
in China, it's they're offering a reverse snake and ladder, saying you were an ordinary researcher in, say, Canada. You come here, we'll make you the head of an institute. And then when you decide to go back to Canada, you have this heft saying, look, you had access to the Chinese Communist Party. You've run your own institute, which was very well funded, that produced all this cutting edge research. And so you essentially offered him or her the ladder up.
Step up. Yeah, I mean, okay, they're promoting their own people in a strategic way as long as you toe the party line, it sounds
Exactly.
like. We've got two more great questions coming. I'm going to pose one of my own, and then we'll bring them in. And it seems that China is sitting very far onto this illiberal side and curbing individual liberties. And the current narrative in the world is essentially that yes, but we rely on China to some degree to produce our goods, to trade with, and that's propping up a lot of our, let's call it, lifestyles in the West. So to what extent should we be just tolerant to this level of or lack of liberty that's happening in China?
I think the lack of liberty comes more from China's purchase of elites than it does on dependence on China. Remember, when COVID first came out, a lot of countries, at that time Trump was still in charge, but Trump, especially Macron in France, were very clear that they wanted to diversify their supply sources out of China. And there was an exodus of companies which India vied for, but nobody, of course, comes here. Vietnam was a much better bet to go off to, and things
Yeah,
like
there's the tax break and so on, and yeah,
that. Right.
yeah,
So there was this entire thing happening out there. But the real control comes in terms of, for simple example, there is no genocide happening in India. Yet you will have the Washington Post and the New York Times every week talk about a genocide in India. There was
right.
an Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang, where 2 million people were literally put into re-education into concentration camps. The New York Times ran one story, two, maybe two, three stories about it, and the rest of it is just focusing on China business. Now, that's what you call an elite purchase, right? So China manages that aspect of it extremely well.
And the New York Times is owned by Bezos?
I think the Washington Post is owned by Bezos.
Washington Post is owned by
Uh,
Bezos. Okay, but it's in
so
that sphere.
Sulzberger's, yeah. But
Okay.
Sulzberger's would have other business interests which would all tie into China. There isn't a single business interest today anywhere in the world, including in India, that does not tie into China very significantly. But there is a ray of hope, and that ray of hope is 3D printing and additive manufacturing. Because once that comes online, uh, the entire arbitrage of land, labor, tax breaks, etc., goes out of the window, where you can, instead of it, where it's cheaper to import toothbrushes and bulbs from China. And let's face it, China became rich on the basis of making toothpaste, toothpaper, and bulbs for your tube lights and things like that. Uh, Once that starts going out, that's where the Chinese story starts ending. That's where the unlimited push of funds starts ending. And now that they're caught in a middle income trap, see, China to move to a high income trap is very easy. You need to liberalize. This is that inflection point. This is why I brought up South Korea, Taiwan, and all those countries which are horrible, nasty dictatorships in the 80s, which democratized because they valued their people.
Yeah.
Here, they refuse to democratize, so you can't enter that next level of growth. And initially, of course, India will get screwed because we do very low end manufacturing. But once additive manufacturing comes to the stage of mobile phones and things like that, that's when China really gets screwed. And China isn't growing enough that quickly in manufacturing for it to be able to, well, it's, let's put it more speculatively, it's, will 3D manufacturing catch up at the same rate as China's growth? Because China's growth was, say, like this in 10 years, but now it's like this. Whereas additive
Yes.
manufacturing is growing much faster. When will the two lines intersect? That's kind of
That's a beautiful, yeah, beautiful way of thinking, and it gives us a tangential point, a sort of tangible point to look at. We're going to try a quick fire round. We've got a couple of really good questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask you to keep your answers short, succinct, but precise
yeah.
and accurate. A little bit of a challenge for you. So we've got on from Peter Emerson, director of the De Border Institute, and Peter, if I misinterpret your question, please clarify. But he said, why, if the USA divides into two and elects a Trump? So I'm assuming he's saying Trump was a divisive figure. Why would China want to follow that crazy example?
That's assuming the USA separates into two. I think you'll find a lot more internal fissures in China, Peter, because it is fear that holds China together. You remove that fear, and we really don't know. America might break into two, but China might break into 100. It has in the past. I mean, every time central authority broke up, you had hundreds of warlords fighting each other.
Wow. Okay, so America might break into two, but China might break into 100. Okay, we have it. So hopefully Peter comes back in. It'd be good if Peter, if you want to join us on the table afterwards. I think there's a fantastic discussion to be had here. So for those in our audience, I'm going to take the last two questions. But if you want to continue this discussion, at the top of your screen, click on the networking area, and we'll be joining, I think, the governance table straight after this fireside with Abhijitji, and we can ask him questions. Okay, final two. We're asking for sound bites here. So Himalayan, it's from Vishal Sharma. Himalayan glaciers are shrinking. How can we influence China to adopt a more sustainable and equitable policy of water use?
This is one thing I have no complaints with China about, because all the dams we've been looking at in Tibet uh, have been run of the mill dams. They're not actually blocking and diverting water. And this is a commitment that the Chinese refuse to sign on to formally, but at every single session, they've made commitments. Every single water session I've been to, they've made commitments saying, we will not divert Himalayan waters for our use. So that's not something that we need to be worried about right now. Of course, I'd be happier if we institutionalized it and made it into a legally binding treaty.
Sure. Okay. And Hirav Patel, he's a research scientist. He's in this area. He's saying, I've seen that Chinese students steal code and data and send it continuously back. So I can relate to this in reality. He seems to have some experience here. Do you think there will be a ban on Chinese students in Western universities in the near future?
They already are. There are lots of sensitive subjects where Chinese students are not allowed. And the thing is, uh, they can steal as much code as they want. One of the reasons the West is a bit lackadaisical about banning Chinese students, other than the huge quantities of money they bring in, is the fact that there's two parts to manufacturing: the how and the why. They can take back the how through stealing code, but the very fact that they're stealing code means that they don't know the why. Okay, and the why is the most important part of manufacturing, because when things go wrong, it is the why, the first principles that help you solve problems. Very
Yeah, it's like
frequently.
yeah, I stole a plane, but I have no idea how to fix the engine, so I'm
Yeah.
in trouble if it breaks. Okay, okay. Okay, so there's a couple more good questions, but I'm going to ask our audience members to join us on our table afterwards. And the question, Abhijit, I'd like to leave you with is, tomorrow you wake up and you're Prime Minister of India. Yeah? How would you tackle and approach China as India's closest neighbor?
Um, my approach would be, I'm sorry to sound very philosophical about this, but typically Hindu: look within yourself. You can't control what's outside, you have to look within. And that's to see to it that our absolutely dreadful system of regulations that throttle and strangle our industry end.
So
So
look inside,
look
open up
inside
India
for economic
inside.
liberalization, and our people will manage.
Okay. And in terms of sort of realpolitik or dealing with China's front-footed stance?
With realpolitik, see, the thing is, as long as you are weak, you kowtow. When you gain strength, then you stand up.
Brilliant.
So I like the system
Unequivocal.
of kowtowing. See, when you're distant, when you're from the emperor, you know how the kowtow worked. You entered the throne room, and you kneeled. You got down on your knees. Your head touched the floor 3 times. Then you got up. You walked 3 steps. Then you got down on your knees again, and then 3 times your head touches the floor. And then finally, when you're close enough to kill not yet to kill the emperor, 3 times. And finally, when you come close enough to kill the emperor, the dagger comes out. That's what you do. Till then, you genuflect.
Okay. So the fate of the weak is to be basically used by the strong. So India should become
Right.
strong
Weak
in its
must
own
suffer.
right.
They will.
Beautiful, lovely. Thank you very much. So we're looking forward to continuing this on the table afterwards. So thank you for joining, and thank you to our audience at home for joining this panel, this fireside at Sustainable Narratives 2022. If you'd like to find out more about Vichaar Manthan, please visit our website, or if you want to get involved, feel free to visit our booth. It's just on the right of the networking area. Jump in there and then click "I'm interested" or join a table to talk to one of our team members. Our next fireside will kick off in about half an hour or so, and it will be on the myth of benevolent imperialism. So we'll see you then. Abhijit, thank you very much, and we'll see you on the table shortly.
This was great fun, and I hope all of you guys had fun too. Thank you so much, Raviji.
Brilliant.